Thank you. I am Mahimna Kelkar. I'm a PhD student at Cornell and Cornell Tech, and today I want to talk about order-fair consensus for blockchains. So this talk is primarily based on two of our papers on fair ordering with co-authors at Cornell, Cornell Tech, IC3, and University of Washington at Seattle. So to begin, I just wanted to briefly recall the state machine replication or consensus abstraction that underlies blockchains. So traditionally in the classical or permission setting, there are a set of nodes that receive transactions from clients. And the goal is to order these transactions in a consistent manner. And some of these servers can be faulty or even actively malicious. But even then, security should still hold. And in the permissionless setting, say using proof of work, these servers are essentially replaced by miners who can dynamically enter and exit the system. But the basic abstraction is the same. There's transactions that are coming in from users, and the network as a whole kind of needs to agree on a consistent ordered log. So now we expect two properties from consensus protocols usually. The first is consistency or safety, and the second is liveness. So consistency will ensure that all honest parties will eventually agree to the same view of the final output ledger. So essentially, adversarial nodes cannot split the network's view. And liveness means that new transactions from users are incorporated into this ledger soon enough. So this means that adversarial nodes cannot stall the network. But while these properties are sort of enough for classical applications, the claim is that they're no longer sufficient for a lot of the blockchain applications that we've seen today. So primarily, this is because neither consistency nor liveness provides any guarantee on the actual ordering of transactions. So this is kind of discomforting to see, especially since it's very easy to manipulate this ordering in practice. So this is evident while looking at classical protocols, for example. So many protocols like PBFT or hot stuff in the classical setting are leader-based, where there's a leader that proposes an extension to the ordered log, and all of the other replica nodes sort of follow along. And some of the protocols allow the leader to rotate every so often. But in all of these protocols, whoever the current leader is, it can propose any transaction ordering that it wants. So essentially, if the leader is adversarial, it has the power to arbitrarily manipulate the ordering. And no sort of prior permission protocol guarantees any notion of a fair transaction ordering. So surprisingly, like permissionless blockchains aren't much better either. And even though they're fundamentally more decentralized, a block miner has complete control over the ordering of transactions in the block that it mines. And this sort of happens all the time. So you could imagine miners being bribed or incentivized to prioritize specific orderings or colluding with users to give priority to their orderings. So a miner with like a small but non-negligible amount of mining power that's not enough to, say, 51% attack the network can still be able to impact the ordering for a non-negligible fraction of the blocks and users. So this is what we call like an ephemeral or short-term centralization of ordering in permissionless blockchain. So although everything else is mostly decentralized, there's this sort of short-term centralization with respect to ordering. So all of this talk kind of raises the central question that drove our papers. So why exactly is fair ordering and consensus so important? So there's other reasons like an unfair ordering can impact like transaction validity, but the biggest consideration by far is in decentralized finance or DeFi. And decentralized finance is pretty hype right now. This entire session has been on DeFi. And this is just like a partial list of financial instruments that have popped up on the Ethereum ecosystem in just the last few years. So just to take a very simple example to see how transaction ordering can impact DeFi, let's take the case of decentralized exchanges or DEXs. So essentially, decentralized exchanges allow users to swap between cryptocurrencies at like an exchange rate that's predetermined or programmatically computed by the mechanism inside the exchange. So suppose that the current exchange allows, let's say, user Alice to swap one Ethereum token for 100 Uniswap tokens. But for a different transaction ordering, possibly an unfair transaction ordering, Alice could get a worse exchange price of, let's say, just 98 Uniswap tokens. So this means like that an adversary who can manipulate the transaction ordering can profit from this difference in exchange prices by carefully inserting its own transactions. For example, just before Alice's transaction to buy it from the exchange and then sell it to Alice for a profit. So this kind of attack is like front running and taking advantage of arbitrage in the market. So basically, the end result of this is the attacker can steal a part of the profit that Alice could have made just by manipulating the transaction ordering. So this is quite reminiscent of like high frequency trading and front running on Wall Street as popularized by the Michael Lewis novel Flash Boys. And this kind of front running has also been quite rampant on permissionless blockchains like Ethereum, as shown initially by this Flash Boys 2.0 paper a few years ago, as well as a number of more recent works. So more problematically, the finding was that all of this front running can be done by bots that are not even in charge of the underlying consensus. And these bots can sort of compete with each other to see who can extract the most value from unsuspecting users. And the impact of consensus nodes or miners actually manipulating the ordering would clearly be far worse. And that sort of brings us to this problem of MEV, or miner extractable value, which is the quantification of the value that's extractable from the system by messing with this transaction ordering. And in the last year, just for a few DeFi contracts on Ethereum, roughly $500 million in USD has been extracted. And the real number is probably much higher if we take into account the whole ecosystem. And this has sort of been exponentially rising. Like out of these 500 million, 350 million have been just since this January. And MEV may actually pose even bigger threats in the near future. So in light of the proposed EIP 1559, which cuts transaction fees sent to the miner, miners have been super unhappy with this proposal. And mining pools have begun to add front-running software to make up for the lost profits. Like we had these articles saying Ethermine, which is a large mining pool, was adding front-running software to increase its profits from lost revenue. What's more problematic is that some miners have actually begun to auction off the right to choose the ordering in the block that they mine. So instead of front running themselves, they're sort of asking other people who want to front run the block to bid in how much they would pay to front run in this block and sell it to the highest bidder, which is clearly much more problematic. And the goal of MEV auctions really was to make MEV more transparent, but unfortunately in the long run, it will really make the ordering problem significantly worse. It makes centralization worse, and it can cause a lot of instability in the system, as pointed out by a number of articles. So we need a more fundamental solution to this MEV problem. So our focus has been on sort of solving this order manipulation attack problem at the consensus layer. So this sort of makes it agnostic to the underlying application being considered. So it should definitely benefit DeFi applications like decentralized exchanges, but because it also abstracts out like economic incentives, it should also be useful in like non-DeFi applications that could benefit from ordering guarantees. So some sort of first come, first serve sales or ICOs. And we aim to handle sort of a more broad notion of this order manipulation that's not just restricted to front running or censorship. And basically the goal is we want to consider any possible ways in which an adversary could benefit from manipulating the transaction ordering. So just for a brief comparison to current techniques on some sort of restriction to what the adversary can do with the ordering, there is censorship resistance, which has been popularized for several decades. Basically means that honest transactions will eventually be ordered, and a lot of the current permission protocols satisfy this, and most permissionless protocols by design also satisfy this, like Ethereum, Bitcoin. But in all of this, like it says nothing about reordering and insertions of transactions or displacement of transactions. So all of this reordering is still possible. Another clever technique is to use some sort of random leader election where you're electing leaders randomly. So you're not focusing on one particular leader to do all of the front running. But here, whenever an adversarial leader gets elected, they can still order unfairly however they want. Some more popular crypto techniques are kind of hiding transaction data before ordering the transaction. So before actually revealing the contents of the transaction. So you order the transaction before its contents are revealed in light to prevent these sort of front-running attacks. So this has traces roots back to like causal ordering from several decades ago. as well as like threshold encryption or commit and reveal schemes to hide the transaction data. But here, theoretically, still blind kind of reordering is possible. And what's more problematic is you can have an off-band collusion with someone outside of the blockchain, or collude via like reorder via metadata, and still cause a lot of reordering attacks. Another possible technique is, use just a random transaction ordering. So let's say even if we had a random transaction ordering that you could not sort of mess with the randomness, I'll still claim that this is not really fair because you could just flood the network with a lot of transactions. So basically, if you flood the network with a lot of transactions, there's still a very high probability that one of those transactions gets in before an honest user's transaction and front runs it. The problem with this is a lot of times you don't really need to know the transaction content in order to front run the user or take advantage of like ordinary users. So this is like very useful in these kinds of scenarios. For example, this was seen in like the BZX ICO, where you could just flood the network and get in within the first few transactions to get a better price for the ICO sale. In contrast, like our notions of fair ordering will guarantee that honest transactions which arrive into the network first are ordered earlier regardless of the adversary. So now I kind of want to move on to how we define fair ordering in general. So here's sort of a natural definition we started with, which we call gamma receive order fairness for some order fairness parameter gamma. So basically it means if, say, it's a large fraction of nodes, gamma times n, are input m1 before m2, then all of the honest nodes will deliver m1 before m2. So this is a definition, the permission setting, where we have n nodes, but we can extrapolate this to the permissionless setting, where you think about the nodes, the number of nodes dynamically changing as well. But the problem with this definition actually lies in social choice theory in this Condorcet paradox, which basically implies that global orderings can be non-transitive even when individual orderings themselves are transitive. So let's say we have like 3 users, Alice, Bob, and Carol, and they receive 3 nodes, sorry, and they receive transactions in the order XYZ, YZX, and ZXY. So you can kind of see that 2 nodes have received X before Y, 2 nodes have received Y before Z, and 2 nodes have received Z before X. So basically, if you look closely, this is sort of a cyclic ordering, which means that it's impossible to order these transactions in a fair way. So sort of no protocol can achieve gamma equals 2/3 receive fairness. For the simplest case of gamma equals 1, it is possible when the adversary is non-corrupting, but it is impossible even in the presence of a single Byzantine node unless you assume some very strong synchronous conditions. So I just state the impossibility result here, very informally, that no protocol can achieve all of consistency, liveness, and receive order fairness for a large enough network delay. So we need basically some way to weaken this fairness requirement. And I want to point out here that choosing a good fairness definition is very important. And for one, it has to be achievable in a reasonable sense, and it should not be vacuous in that it's just satisfied all the time, or it's not really relevant to standard like front running or order manipulation attacks. Like it should really be able to account for those attacks. And it turns out that the most natural definitions that you think of don't really work, like basically choosing a median timestamp and of like all the received times of all the nodes, because it doesn't really reflect a first in, first out kind of notion. So we actually explored plenty of different notions in our paper, but here's sort of the one that we settled on, which we call batch order fairness. So this is very similar to the receive order fairness I was talking about earlier, with one small weakening, in that instead of saying like this transaction M1 should be ordered before M2, we say no later than. So we allow transactions to be ordered sort of in the same batch. They can still be executed in a total ordering, but the ordering of transactions within this batch is not considered unfair. So the key idea will be to deliver these paradoxical orderings or non-transitive orderings into the same batch. And the batch here is not the same as a block. It can be like much smaller. And it really only contains these paradoxical orderings. So in that sense, it is somewhat minimal in that our protocols will achieve the stronger version of receive order fairness. except when it's impossible to achieve due to this paradox I mentioned earlier. And it is achievable in practice, and it's not made vacuous in light of usual front-running kind of attacks. So it does deal with those front-running attacks very well. So I want to move on to talking a little bit about our fair ordering protocols, both in the permissioned and permissionless setting. I'll start with our permission fair ordering protocol, Equitas. I'll just briefly overview the design here and not go into too many details, but sort of build intuition on what the protocol design looks like. So basically, our protocol takes place in 3 stages, and all of the transactions that are sort of input into the system go through each of these 3 stages before being delivered to the output log. So the first stage is the gossip stage, the second stage is the agreement stage, and the third is the finalization stage, after which the transactions are output into the blockchain. So in the gossip stage, honest nodes broadcast the transactions they've received to all of the other nodes. And at the same time, they sort of store broadcasts received from other nodes into local logs that contain basically the view of broadcasts by the other nodes. And we use this primitive called FIFO broadcast that basically guarantees that honest nodes will have consistent local logs, even if the sender is malicious and does not broadcast in the order that they receive in. The second stage of the Equitas protocol is agreement. Basically, in the agreement stage, all of the nodes will attempt to agree on which local logs to use to order a transaction. So you have a set of bunch of local logs, but because of the broadcast, different nodes may have received different portions of those logs. So you want to reach an agreement on which of those local logs to use to order a transaction. And this can be done using just standard Byzantine agreement. And in the end, it will guarantee that all of the honest nodes use the same local logs to finalize a transaction. In fact, they'll use all of the same data to finalize a transaction. This essentially means that we can use this finalization stage in a completely leaderless and no extra communication fashion. So the finalization stage will output the transaction ordering into the final log by taking these orderings in the local logs from the agreement stage, and it requires no communication. So how does the finalization stage order 2 transactions? Well, roughly, if many of the local logs that have been agreed on in the agreement stage contain some transaction tx prime before tx, then we can say that this tx is waiting for tx prime to be delivered. And now we can construct this dependency graph where vertices represent transactions and an edge from A to B represents that this transaction B is waiting for A to be delivered. And if there are no clear winners, then we can still try to. So I'll show how if there are no clear winners, how we can order transactions. So basically, there's 2 problems to solve at this point. So one is that the graph may not be connected or it's not complete because of 2 nodes. There may not be a single clear winner. The second problem is that the graph may be acyclic, which is no thanks to the Condorcet paradox that I mentioned earlier, which leads to these non-transitive orderings. So the key idea for this is to wait for a common descendant between 2 transactions that are incomparable at this point, and then order using the maximum number of descendants. And this is sort of key to get consistency of the final output ordering among all of the nodes. And that's why we sort of wait for the common descendant to arrive, because at that point, you sort of fix the number of descendants of each of those transactions. So the other problem, as I mentioned, is that these graphs can be, again, have cycles. So to get a total ordering, the key idea is to compute a condensation graph by collapsing the strongly connected components that basically contain these cycles. And we'll deliver transactions in the same component into the same batch. So that sort of is like a very rough overview of our protocol. The synchronous protocol works when n greater than 2f over 2 gamma minus 1, where f represents the number of Byzantine nodes that we have in the permission setting, and n is the total number of nodes. So we have n greater than 2f, or we need an honest majority, even when gamma equals 1. And the asynchronous protocol requires n greater than 4f over 2 gamma minus 1 nodes. The interesting observation here is that these primitives that we use, the FIFO broadcast and Byzantine agreement, are somewhat weak primitives in the sense that they can be realized from any sort of ordinary consensus protocol. So this leads to a powerful observation in that we can take any standard consensus protocol and apply our design as a general compiler to transform the protocol into one that also provides order fairness. So I'll also briefly talk about fair ordering protocols in the consensus, in the permissionless setting, and how we move our design from the permission setting to be useful here. So our main strategy here at a high level is to convert the permissionless problem into an analogous one in the permission setting. And we'll use this finalization technique that we had in the Equitas protocol from the permission setting to determine the final ordering here. So we'll call this the player replaceability lemma, which I'll describe only abstractly here. So in the permission setting, each node had sort of one vote to convey its transaction ordering, and there was n nodes, they had n transaction orderings, one represented one node. So the player replaceability lemma essentially allows us to continue the transaction orderings from other nodes using like proof of work mining or proof of stake mining. And essentially a number of orderings can be fixed, say D at the start of the protocol, and all of the nodes in the system will add on to these orderings using their own transaction receive order times. And the final ordering can be computed using this distilled version of our permission protocol, specifically the finalization algorithm. So this is somewhat tricky. I'm only giving a brief overview here because the adversary can now influence some part of all of the orderings rather than all part of a few of the orderings. But this turns out to be not a problem, and we proved this in the player replaceability lemma. So I'll show a couple protocol designs that we have in the permissionless setting. I'll start with this very intuitive single chain protocol where all of the nodes will mine a single proof of work chain. And the core idea where we take these D transaction orderings is to modularize this chain and have into D chains, and each of these will represent a transaction ordering similar to the permission setting. So here we have three modular chains, like all of the blue blocks are in one chain, all the green ones are another, and all the red ones are in a third one. So although, for example, the proof of work continuation of this blue block is this red one, its logical continuation or semantic continuation is its preceding blue block. So this kind of modularizes the chain into this blue chain, green chain, and red chain. And basically a transaction will be mined into all of these modular chains. So each transaction will be mined once into all of these chains. And each of the modular chains will represent an ordering of transactions on which we'll apply the finalization protocol. So the key idea why this works is that the adversary, even if it can front run or manipulate the ordering in some of these chains, it should not be able to do so in a majority of these chains. And that's why we end up with this fair ordering notion. So basically we showed that these design of D modular chains is sort of equivalent to D virtual parties in a permission setting. And the cool part is that this number of chains D does not need to depend on anything other than the security parameter of the system. And as I said, we use this Equitas finalization on these D chains to generate the fair ordering. We also have a more parallel protocol design where we can mine these D chains simultaneously using a D for one proof of mining trick from previous literature. So the protocol is very intuitive. The proofs are somewhat complicated, so I won't describe them here. But the idea, again, is the same. We're mining these D chains in parallel now. And again, we'll use this Equitas finalization to extract a fair ordering from the parallel chains. So just to sort of sum up this work and sort of talk about the upshots, our work is the first one to formalize a fair ordering property that's general for this consensus abstraction. This is sort of the first work to do so, but there's, I think, a long line of work or future work that's ahead. So some of the problems that we should that we hope to tackle are with regards to like efficiency of our designs, because right now they're sort of bulky in that they're sort of general compilers from any consensus protocol. So can we do things more efficiently and still get the notion of fair ordering? So basically, fair ordering, I think, is very important for a lot of blockchain applications, and I can describe just a few ones to sum up. So I talked about decentralized exchanges, and decentralized
Sorry,
exchanges how front running.
we have very little time, so it would be
Last
great if you can wrap up. Okay.
Just the last slide. Yep. So it can prevent front running and arbitrage in decentralized exchanges, and can give fair transaction prices to the users as opposed to any other form of ordering. You can also do like first come first serve ICOs or incentives that you get a better price when you for the first 1,000 tokens that are purchased, or any sort of fair auctions that prevent like temporary censorship of bids or reordering that's received before the closing time. So I'll sort of end here. Please feel free to reach out to me with any questions over my email. Always happy to chat on fairness of consensus.